now joined in the studio by Marco Vincenzo, who's a leading expert on geopolitics and economics. A very good morning to you. It's interesting that everyone says he's been sidelined rather than sacked. So if Yanis Varoufakis was such a liability, then why not just get rid of him?
It would reflect poorly on the government, and particularly for its voter base. So in order to save face, they say, you know, he's still the finance minister technically, but now it's going to be the deputy foreign minister for economics who's going to be in charge of the talks and actually part of the inner circle of the prime minister.
Could he still cause trouble on the sidelines?
Yes, I mean, he can cause trouble on the sidelines if he gets to twittering, for example, or starts beginning to say things that will unnecessarily cause further animosity with European leaders. Right now, Greece is at a very critical stage, and the last thing it needs is unnecessary animosity and rhetoric. It's the key dates that the European officials have pointed to as May 9th. That's 3 days before 750 million euros are due to the IMF. The Prime Minister has expressed confidence that he thinks that by May 9th, the deal will be reached. But once again, it's sort of a game of conciliatory rhetoric and also defiance. Conciliatory in the sense, yes, he's confident that a deal will be reached, but defiant in the sense that he's also threatening a referendum if a deal is not reached. So in this case, he's still sending out, emitting conflicting signals.
But in terms of Varoufakis, the inference is that he didn't get on well with his EU counterpart. So what was the straw that finally broke the camel's back?
It was two things. You have to look in terms of the substance and the style. The substance, since the new government, the new Tsipras government came into power about 3 months ago, there was deadlock and stalemate in terms of talks, the substance of the talks. That was further coupled with abrasiveness. He had an ability, he wanted to, for example, lecture his fellow finance ministers.
Rather than talking with them.
Yes, grandstanding, posturing, that created a lot of animosity unnecessarily. That's in terms of style and process, and that's very important because in order to get along, you need a good dialogue. So it was that sort of, that abrasiveness that basically, you know, that reached a point whereby the finance ministers were in Riga in Latvia for a meeting last week, to a point where there was complete breakdown, where actually Varoufakis left the meeting early, and the signal was put directly to the prime minister: you need to replace him, you need to sideline him because we're getting nowhere and the clock is ticking.
Euclid Tsakalotos is seen as the obvious replacement, Oxford educated. So will he be acceptable to his EU counterparts and indeed the IMF, because there are more players involved in this than just the EU?
I don't know if it's a matter of being acceptable. The bottom line is substance, is something that they get accomplished.
Does he have the substance?
It all depends upon the willingness of the government to accept the term. They have to present terms. They have to present something serious in terms of reforms. It's a basic deal here. You get cash and you have to implement reforms, and it comes down to the substance. The devil's in the detail. If their proposals for reform are realistic and acceptable to the European officials, and then things could move. The tranche will be released. The 7.2 billion euros will be released to Greece. So it actually, I think we're beyond style now.
Sure.
It comes down to serious reform and serious proposals.
Yeah, because this is always the accusation that's been levelled against Greece, that what it's offered so far has been inadequate, it's fallen short. What is it the EU wants? Because you're talking about the money in May, there's also the much bigger deal in June as well. So what it puts on the table is the thing which really determines the speed and how much it gets.
Including labour reform, an overhaul of the labour reform system, pension reform, privatization of many state-owned assets. These are things that the previous Greek government, Antonis Samaras, he was making progress toward it, but not enough for the European officials. So now many of those reforms that were discussed with the previous governments are still on hold. And it's that the officials, the Eurozone officials, are waiting for progress specifically on all those points.
You see, I could see the need for a referendum if, for example, they put forward resolutions or solutions, this is the Greeks, to the EU, and they could turn around and say, well, OK, then, we need to put this to the public because this goes outside the remit on which we campaigned to get into power in the first place.
Referendum requires time and requires money. Greece has no time and it's very limited on money. It's practically desperate for cash. So in terms, I don't think the referendum, if they had been serious negotiations, and in the past 3 months, and it got to the point where it could go to a referendum, it may have been understandable. But the fact is that 3 months have practically been wasted. There's been no progress.
So it's an idle threat when it's thrown into the ring by Mr. Tsipras.
It's an unnecessary threat. He's trying, once again, it's that tone of defiance for his domestic audience. And also, there's also the threat that if Greece does exit, there can be a reaction, a popular reaction, and there's a threat that it could trigger an election. And if Greece does exit the euro, and if by any chance there happens to be an election, I don't think he'd fare very well.
Sure, because from the perspective of the Europeans, they could turn around and say, look, we want you to stay, but if you leave because you default on your debts, etc., at the end of the day, we have the firewalls in place to withstand the shock.
The argument of firewalls is still somewhat questionable. The Eurozone is far better prepared than it was back in the days of May and June 2012 when there were back-to-back elections and Greece's exit from the euro was very, very possible, was on the brink. And for the past 3 years has been, I think what happens is that in the past 3 years, the political and business establishments of Europe have been preparing for this moment. And especially in the past 3 months, and as we approach that May 9th, it's still a possibility. In my opinion, we may look into historical hindsight, and historical hindsight, the point of no return for Greek exit may already have been passed.
And yet they're still there.
We'll see.
Okay, then. Marco Vincenzo, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your analysis. Thank you.